Okay, well, the historical origin of the subject called history begins with the Europeans during the Renaissance era. But you have to know something prior to the Renaissance era. We're talking about during the time of, or the middle of the 16th century, which is the Renaissance era, or the second Renaissance era. You have the first Renaissance era, meaning in the 15th century, which is arts and crafts, and then you have the second Renaissance that came about during the time of the 16th century. We're talking about a literary Renaissance era. Okay, but now also you have to factor in the school system that the Europeans was beginning to create in Europe at that time. But then let's progress back a little bit prior to the coming of the European school system. You have to go back to one Johannes Gutenberg, who had invented a printing press with movable print in 1437. He had no money to continue to finance his endeavor of operating a printing press, along with the fact that during this time, we're talking about the 15th century, because we're talking about 1437, the Europeans throughout Europe could not read or write. There was no school system for the Europeans. So the only people that really could read or write were people who were associated with the Roman Catholic Church monastery school system at that time, which came about at a later date. So what I'm saying is that during this time of Johannes Gutenberg having no money to continue to operate his printing press, and along with the fact that the people of Europe could not read or write, he had to borrow money from another individual by the name of Johannes Fuss. And he borrowed this money from Johannes Fuss with a high interest rate, which he couldn't pay back. So Johannes Fuss confiscated his printing press, and thus beginning to do printing, etc., etc. Now, the first thing that was printed in 1475 was the Old Testament Bible for the Christians, or for the Christian community. You see, at this time, the Roman Catholic Church was beginning to build in Rome the Vatican by building St. Peter's Church. They began to build St. Peter's Church in 1445. And from that point on, from 1445, which, and 181 years later, they were well on the way of establishing the Vatican with other buildings around St. Peter's Church, which is known today as St. Peter's Basilica. They built it over the catacombs. So the Roman Catholic Church was up and about at that time. And they were the only ones that had a school system, which they trained their priests in and through this school system. Okay, now here comes Johannes Fuss, who had confiscated the printing press from Johannes Gutenberg, who had invented the printing press in 1437. Like I said before, the first thing that was printed was this Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament Bible, as they call it, which is the first 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, or the Old Testament. They're all one and the same. So this left the Roman Catholic Church without any literature that was pertaining to their object, which is, their object is Jesus the Christ. So in 1500, Pope Alexander VI commissioned a man, a playwright at that time by the name of Desiderius Erasmus, to write something on the object of Christianity, which is Jesus the Christ. So now what he did, he took him 16 years to come out with what is known today as a Novum Instrumentum, or the 3 synoptic gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, because they always tell you that John came later, which John did come later. John came out of the King James Version of the Bible of 1611. You see, that chapter John was created at that point, you see, by Lancelot Andrews and his group of theologians who created this Bible known as the King James Version with the fourth gospel in it, John. You see, for King James in 1611. But let's go back. Now, in the meantime, like I said before, the printing press was being used because the first thing they printed was this Old Testament Bible. And Johannes Fuss, who was a Jew, came about and printed the Old Testament for the Christian community only because, see, the Jewish community had their own literature, which is the Sefer HaTorah and the Talmud. Well, the Talmud really wasn't created then, but they had Sefer HaTorah literature first, which was all handwritten, the Torah, which was used by the rabbis to teach their believers and followers in Orthodox Judaism. But that goes back into another subject. Now, with the printing press, with movable print, being used in Europe, being used to print the world's first Bible, or the Old Testament Bible, which was printed in 1475, like I mentioned before, it found Johannes Fuss in a very strange position. The strange position that he was founded in was that the masses of people could not read or write. So you can have a printing press that will print up hundreds of books or thousands of books, but who do you have to read these books? So there was no school system in Europe. The people, like I said before, the masses of people could not read or write. So what the Jews did, they went into the Roman Catholic Church, and they got a man by the name of Martin Luther out of that church. This was in 1517. And they encouraged and financed Martin Luther to go against the Roman Catholic Church to try and get this church to reform. That was called the Reform Movement, or the Reformation Movement. Okay? And he, in 1517, he nailed 95 reform theses on the church door, castle door in Wittenberg, Germany, for the Roman Catholic Church to reform. Okay? Now, in the meantime, the Jews began to create behind Martin Luther a Protestant school for the Christian community. See, the Protestant Christians. And the Roman Catholic Church countered with that by creating parochial schools for the secular community. Okay? So now, this is bringing forth what is known in history as the European Renaissance era. See, now I had to tell you all this in order to answer the question, where did the history or the historical origin of history begin? It began right there in the European school system that they have now began to create. In order to have any type of school system, you have to have a curriculum in the school system. Okay? So therefore, they use the Bible, which was now the Old Testament and the New Testament. They use the Bible as a formula for history. See, the Bible was used, you go back and if you can remember, the Bible was used all the way up into all the way into this country. The Bible was used for the teaching of history, you see. And what they did was that they began to use this Bible to create a curriculum for the foundation of history. And the Europeans is credited today with the historical origin, or the ones that create history by way of using history as a discipline in their school system, or their beginning school system during the Renaissance era. And that's where you will find history first began. And whoever writes history controls history. And the rest of the race of the people did not have a history or did not have a subject called history. They never wrote a history of themselves. Ancient Egyptians never wrote a history of themselves. And if they did, you can't read it anyway because it's in hieroglyphics, and the hieroglyphics has never been deciphered. And the rest of the races of people had no alphabet to write with, because the ancient Egyptians were the only people on planet Earth that had a writing system. They had three forms of writing: Meta-Neter hieroglyphic, the hieratic dramatic, and the phonetic alphabet, which is being used today all over the world, that we use today in our own writing system right here in the United States of America. And so during the time of antiquity, the ancient Egyptians were the only ones that had a writing system, because they invented what is known as the alphabet. And the alphabet can only be invented one time. Once it's invented, it cannot be invented anymore. So during the time of antiquity, they were the only people on earth that were a literate people. The rest of the people were illiterate. You see? So therefore, you have to understand that, and understand that this is where, in Europe, as a discipline, history was created for and by the Europeans. So they wrote themselves in history as being the prototype race of people on earth, because they controlled history. And they wrote about the other races of people, the Chinese, the people of India, the ancient Egyptians. They wrote about the Africans, and etc., etc. So therefore, they can control the subject. And they put it into their school system, in their curriculum, and they began to teach this history, this discipline, from generation to generation to generation until you have it today.
Now, was this history accurate?
No.
How was it falsified?
Well, you have to go into each item of history, or each section of history, in order for you to find that out. Okay? What they did, they created a system. And within that system and the discipline of history, they wrote about the people of India. The Indians of India had nothing to do with that history that they wrote about and for the Indians. Okay? But generation and generations has passed, and nobody says anything. They accept the history of India simply because it is now in the school system. Okay? The Indians themselves of India accepts this history. The Chinese, the same way. The Africans, the same way. The Europeans, the same way. You see? So whatever they put in there, they teach this discipline about whatever history that they want to attach to whomever they want to attach history to. They continue to teach it from generation to generation. You see? So you have to study the discipline of history and really focus on the discipline of history and what history is all about before you can say, well, okay, this is not true, this is not true, this may be true, but this is not true. And this is what you have to do. But you have to really study that discipline.
Well, one of the ways that the European has used history to control the minds of people around the world is to put himself into ancient history. I'd like for you to explain the role of the Bible in the European manipulation of history, inserting himself where he was not.
Well, the Bible, as you know, is a book that is based on allegory, fiction, and mythology. There's nothing in the Bible that is actual facts. I always say that 99 9/10 or 99 8/10 of every name in the Bible never existed in human form. Okay? So you have a book called the Bible that is false and fictitious literature, and the European have put himself in this Bible because everything in the Bible is European. And he has taken Northeast Africa, which he has renamed the Middle East. And he has taken Northeast Africa. We're talking about Turkey. We're talking about Lebanon. We're talking about Palestine. We're talking about Syria. we're talking about Jordan, we're talking about Iran, Iraq, we're talking about Arabia, we're talking about Yemen, etc. All that's Northeast Africa. He has designated that land over there, that part of Africa, which he has renamed the Middle East, and trained the masses of people throughout the world today to identify that land area as the Middle East. He has designated that land area as the land of the Bible.
Correct.
See, so therefore he has put all of these false and fictitious, non-existent characters in that land area, along with the attached stories to these different characters that never existed in human form. This is how he has used the Bible to do that. And like I said before, he began to use this Bible as a discipline to teach history by. You see? And people use the Bible as a guideline to call themselves learning a form of world history.
Correct.
That's not a real true world history or a real true form of world history, because history, real history, has 4 ingredients in it. The 4 ingredients are time, people, places, and events. Real time, real people, creating events in certain places throughout the world. You see? That's how history is created. Like, for instance, Rosa Parks didn't want to give up her seat one day to a white man on the bus. And everybody knows that story. And she went to jail. They put her in jail. Then here comes Dr. Martin Luther King. And then here comes the Civil Rights Movement. Everybody knows that. So all of that was created by time, people, places, and events. That's history. So that becomes known as real life history. Then you have all these religions, such as Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, etc. They all have a pseudo, false history attached to each and every one of these religions that they teach to the masses of people throughout the world for them to believe that what they are teaching them coming from this religious literature is true world factual history when it's not.
Let's look at how some of that history plays out. Say, for example, when we study history in European schools all over the world, they talk about places like Mesopotamia, Sumer, and they began to position other people than Africans in those places. What does that do in terms of robbing African people from the knowledge of themselves and positioning Europe in the world as a superior people or civilization?
Well, you have to go back into, like you mentioned, Mesopotamia. That's biblical. Okay. And there's never been a Mesopotamia. Never been a Mesopotamia that ever existed on planet Earth. Mesopotamia is supposed to have started in Iraq, okay? But there's never been a Mesopotamia starting in Iraq, only in the Bible. That's where you find Mesopotamia, only in the Bible. In Mesopotamia, they try to create a people known as the Sumerians. That's biblical. When you go to the Bible to look up Sumerians, you won't find Sumerians, but you will find it's 2 related names, such as Akkad or Akkadian and Shinar. Those are the 2 names that you will find in the Bible that relates to the supposed Sumerians. The European scholar community argued all the way up until 1915 the existence of or against the existence of a Sumerian. This is what they had a polemic, an argument among themselves in the European academic community, all the way up until 1915. They argued that. You had Joseph Halévy out of France arguing that. You had Charles Renan out of France arguing against the existence of a Sumerian. Never existed. Then, if you read a little further, and study the Sumerians, they tell you that the Sumerians left no historical trait of themselves. Okay, that their language cannot be identified with any known language group on Earth today. You see, so they can't point to a language or a people speaking a language and say that this is the same language that the Sumerians spoke. So they say there's none that they can identify the Sumerians with any language group on Earth. They said also, if you investigate the Sumerians, they said they cannot identify the Sumerians with any racial group on Earth. That the Sumerians left a picture of themselves. And this picture that they left is that they're going to show you a group of little white men sitting on stools with keen features, with long, keen noses, to identify that the Sumerians or try to imply that the Sumerians were European. See, but yet and still, if we go back, the European academic community up until 1915 argued against the existence of a Sumerian. See, so you keep that in mind. Very important. You see, so you're talking about something that never existed. You're talking about something such as Mesopotamia, Sumerians, Akkadians, Shinarians, all existing only in biblical literature only. That's where you'll find that. So therefore, that's not a real life history. That is a pseudo history created by the Europeans for biblical purposes. Okay. Now, I think you mentioned something about the ancient Egyptians. Where does what now?
Well, I want to ask you this now. You said that they have these plaques with pictures on them. Are you implying that the plaques are fictitious? Didn't they find those plaques archaeological dig and sites in the earth?
No.
How did those plaques come about?
The Europeans created those plaques for the sole purpose of trying to create and prove a Sumerian existence on Earth.
How can you prove that?
How can I prove what?
How can you prove that they created those plaques?
Simply because there was an article that I received from a journal that I subscribed to. And in this journal that I subscribed to, there were two groups of archaeologists arguing between each other. And one group was accusing the archaeology community or archaeologists how they create artifacts and then plant them in the night at a dig. Let's say you're digging over in a certain land area. And late in the night, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, they go out there and plant certain artifacts that they want to be found the next day. Okay? So therefore, that's one of the proofs. You see? And then the second proof is this. The argument that the European community had against the Sumerians, or against the existence of a Sumerian, is very key and very important to understand. Then another thing that you have to understand, there was a group of Americans coming from the University of Chicago. We're talking about Henry Frankfurt, John A. Wilson, Thurkill Jacobson, and Samuel Noah Kramer. They're the ones that created the continuation of the Sumerian, because that Sumerian argument coming from the European academic community was virtually dead until they revived it back in 1944, 46, 45, up in that area. And they began to create a pseudo false supposed history with dates, names, etc. for the Mesopotamian time period that they created against the ancient Egyptian chronology that they also created. The Europeans also created the chronology of ancient Egypt. See, James Henry Breasted, Edward Meyer, and that group, etc., etc. But the Europeans had created a chronology of ancient Egypt prior to James Henry Breasted and Edward Meyer's chronology that was created around the time of the turn of the century. See, they had created a chronology of ancient Egypt way back in the 19th century, middle of the 19th century. See, and the chronology of ancient Egypt is based off of the Bible. And I'll tell our scholars today, our African scholars, you cannot use and do not use the chronology of ancient Egypt as it is being written today. Don't use that, because the ancient Egyptians never wrote a chronology or a history of themselves. It was the Europeans who created that chronology based on the Bible, because the first pharaoh in the chronology of ancient Egypt was Mesram. Mesram is the son of Ham. Ham is the son of Noah. That comes out of the Bible, out of the family and table of nations, etc. Then they're going to say that the Hyksos invaded into Egypt. Okay? There's never been a Hyksos invasion in Egypt. You see? So where are they getting this Hyksos information? They're saying that they're getting the Hyksos information coming from Flavius Josephus quoting Manetho or Manetho. There's never been a Manetho. Supposed to have been a ancient Egyptian priest during the time of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. You see, but that goes into another subject. But then when you trace the Hyksos, they said the Hyksos left no records of themselves. You mean to tell me that they're supposed to have occupied ancient Egypt for 208 years and left no records of themselves? They go on to say, if you investigate the Hyksos, that the Hyksos left no culture traits. You mean to tell me that the Hyksos supposedly occupying ancient Egypt for 208 years left no cultural traits of themselves? Then it goes on to say that the Hyksos sets up Joseph and the Israelites settling in Egypt. So it takes you right back to the Jews, right back to the Bible, etc., etc. So we can't use these different chronologies, you see, because both chronologies, the one of ancient Egypt, which was created by the Europeans, the ancient Egyptians, like I said before, never wrote a chronology themselves, and if they did, you can't read it anyway because it's in hieroglyphics, and the hieroglyphics have never been deciphered. Then you have another supposed chronology of, they call it Mesopotamia. Okay, that chronology, like I said before, was created in the 1940s by Henry Frankfurt, John A. Wilson, Thurkill Jacobson, and Samuel Noah Kramer, all coming out of the University of Chicago. James Henry Breasted, coming out of the University of Chicago, see, created the chronology of ancient Egypt. So you can't use any of that. You have to throw that out. Can't be used.
Let me ask you, when did the study of Egyptian history begin in terms of it really begin to be an investigative interest for the Europeans?
The latter part of the 18th century, heavy in the 19th century.
Before that, Egypt was not written about historical history for anybody?
Well, none that I can trace, or none that one can trace. Mm-hmm. Because, see, the European controls the literature for the world. Okay? And they got interested in Egypt, ancient Egypt, like I said before, in the 18th century.
With Napoleon or what?
Well, it started a little bit before Napoleon, but it became highlighted even more so and strongly approached after Napoleon made his trek over there in ancient Egypt, or in Egypt. Okay, and in the 19th century, the Europeans really turned the heat up on investigating ancient Egypt. In fact, the University of Chicago, at this very moment that I'm talking to you, they created what is known as a Chicago House. They erected a Chicago House over there. And in that Chicago House, it was put up for the sole purpose of studying ancient Egypt. See, they have everything at their disposal They have living quarters over there. They have everything at their disposal to study the historical origin or study ancient Egypt.
Now that's in Chicago.
No, that's over in Egypt.
That's in Egypt.
Egypt.
They have a institution there.
Right, called the Chicago House.
Okay.
In Egypt to study the ancient Egyptians. They've been over there since 1920s.
All right. Now let me ask you this: were there other people like Japanese, Germans, whether outside of the Europeans? Were there other nations studying Egypt, going to Egypt, exploring it, studying, bringing back artifacts, putting up museums as the European did that houses primary Egyptian artifacts?
Not that I know of. Not that I know of. You see, when the Europeans got into the interest of ancient Egypt, then the whole world became aware of it because of their institution.
But they were but they were becoming aware through primarily what the Europeans were saying about ancient Egypt.
Correct.
Okay. So you're saying that the Europeans control most of the information that went out on ancient Egypt, and they themselves were the ones who were doing the interpretation and creation and etc.
Etc. Correct. That's correct.
What purpose would they have a lying to the world about the true history of ancient Egypt and establishing a pseudo nations like Mesopotamia and Babylon and so forth? I know you're saying that they did it to undergird biblical accusations of biblical writings, but can you explain why and for what purpose would they want to do that?
Well, there are different reasons. One is that they wanted to, you got to understand this. Your three major Western religions had to get close to ancient Egypt in order for their religion, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, to be real in the minds of the people. All three of those religions are tied into ancient Egypt.
Why would they have to be tied into ancient Egypt?
Simply because ancient Egypt is the only entity of the two, talking about ancient Egypt and religion. Ancient Egypt is the only one of the two that's real. It's not based on mythology or pseudepigrapha stories and so forth and so on. As to religion, religion relies on literature given to the believer of these religions to believe in. So the stories are there in literary form. So you have to know this, that ancient Egypt, of the two entities, are the only one of the two entities that does not need literature to sustain itself. Correct. The religions need literature to sustain itself, not ancient Egypt. Because you can go over there and look at the greatest edifice that has ever been created on earth, which is the Great Pyramid. The Sphinx over there in the desert. All the other monuments are there. The tombs are there. The ones that wasn't pillaged by the Europeans, and the artifacts stolen and scattered all over the world, etc. Such as when in 1818, when Belzoni was sent over there by the British Museum to get artifacts out of ancient Egypt by any means necessary. And he did his thing over there in doing that, to the tune of 4 floors in the British Museum was filled with ancient Egyptian artifacts, you see. So, getting back to ancient Egypt and the religions. The religions, if you notice, all are close to ancient Egypt. They're tied into ancient Egypt. That's for a reason. Why? Because ancient Egypt is the only thing that's real. The religions, the three major Western religions, Christianity, never been a man ever walked the earth in human form by the name of Jesus Christ, never existed. Islam, there's never been a man that ever walked the earth in human form by the name of a prophet Muhammad. Judaism, there's never been men that ever walked the earth in human form by the name of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or Moses. All religions are man-made, pagan, heathen, occult religions based on mythology. That's all religions are. So they had to, in order to make these religions real, they had to get next to something that was real. And ancient Egypt, of the two entities, does not need literature to sustain itself. But the three major religions and all other man-made religions need literature to sustain itself in the minds of the believer. You see, and then the second thing is that the Europeans coming into the continent of Africa in Egypt, we're talking about Alexander the Greek in 332 BCE. They're the first known, or he was the first known European historically to come into the continent of Africa in Egypt. Okay? And Alexander the Greek. Okay? Not the Great, but the Greek. I don't call any savage who tried to destroy my ancient Egyptian ancestors' culture and civilization great. That's for the Europeans to use that term. I don't. I use Alexander the Greek. All right? Now, Alexander and his successor, Ptolemy I Lagi, called Sotar, who took over the rule of Egypt after the death of Alexander in 323. They became the world's first Egyptians. You see, they were the first Egyptians. You see, so now,
What do you mean?
well, there's a difference between an ancient Egyptian and an Egyptian. See, an ancient Egyptian, one has to be African to be an ancient Egyptian. An Egyptian could be of anyone of any race, creed, or color, like anyone of any race, creed, or color can be an American today. So an Egyptian, you have to distinguish between an ancient Egyptian and an Egyptian. An ancient Egyptian, you have to be Africans, because the ancient Egyptians are Africans. I didn't say we're Africans, they still are Africans. And so these Greeks became the first Egyptians. Okay? And this is what is being portrayed today in different museums around the world. You go down to the Field Museum here in the city of Chicago. They have an exhibit called Inside Egypt. They show you Ptolemaic Egypt. They show you Europeans with hieroglyphic inscriptions on their sarcophagus, with hieroglyphic inscriptions on their paintings and stelas, etc., using the same pose that our ancient Egyptian ancestors posed for their paintings, for their tombs, for their culture, for their civilization, with hieroglyphic inscriptions around those poles. Okay? And this is what is being portrayed today. When you go into Las Vegas, there's a hotel called the Luxor. There's great big old statues up there with European features. See? So this confuses our people. When they look at things like that, they can't relate themselves racially to identify with ancient Egyptians, because here you got these Europeans out there portraying themselves and emulating the ancient Egyptians, our ancestors. See? So this is what they want. They want to bring this forth. It helps them, you see, to give a false illusion to the whole entire world that they were mixed in, or they were the ancient Egyptians, and the ancient Egyptians with their keen features were white or European.
I just want you to touch on, because I think it's very important right here, is what gain is there for the Europeans to project themselves as the ancient Egyptians, in terms of looking at all that Egypt is in terms of science, religions, culture, etc. Why is it necessary for Europeans to steal that?
See, the Europeans want to be, at this very moment, they want to be the prototype race of people on earth. They want to be great, okay? There's nothing that comes out of Europe that can make the European great. Okay? Nothing. Because he was illiterate. He had no alphabet, couldn't write, couldn't read, had no institution. So what did Europe offer for the world? Nothing but a savage. And he's still a savage today. You see? But now here you have the ancient Egyptians who lived in the continent of Africa, in Egypt, who are African people, creating the greatest civilization that has ever existed on planet Earth. Here, the creator, the universal creator, used the ancient Egyptians, our ancestors, as human instruments to bring forth all of creation and civilization for the whole entire world. Everything you see around you came from the culture of the ancient Egyptians.
In terms of?
The chair, furniture, eating utensils, reading, writing, the paper, the pen, the ink. They had three forms of writing: the Meta-Netia hieroglyphic, the hieratic, demotic, and the phonetic alphabet. And they were the first ones on earth to create and invent an alphabet. And the alphabet, once it's invented, can only be invented one time. See? They created mathematics. They created domesticating the earth, domesticating the animals, building brick buildings, living in brick buildings. They had it all. All the science, everything.
Religion?
Correct. No religion. They had a spiritual way of life, but not a religion. They knew the laws of the universe, the cosmic laws of the universe, and that's what they used, and this is what guided them. Okay? So, no religion. Religion is all man-made. But here the Europeans, they had nothing. When Alexander the Greek came into Egypt, he was in awe. When he walked into Egypt, he looked around and said, "My gosh, who are these people? How did they create all this great and glorious, harmonious culture and civilization?" The ancient Egyptians were in tune with nature. They were in tune with the cosmic rhythm of the universe. They were in tune with the creator of the universe. See? The ancient Egyptians had no armies and no jails. There was no corruption in ancient Egypt. Every citizen had a home, food, job, education, etc., etc. All treated fairly. The female was treated equal with the male, and so forth and so on. They had a beautiful civilization until the European came in. And that's where it began to get disrupted. See? Because he wanted to be part of that civilization and culture. He wanted himself to be made part of that. And in my book, The Historical Origin of Christianity, it will walk you through how this European, after the death of Alexander the Greek in 323, we talk about Ptolemy I Lagi, how he wanted to get acceptance in our ancient Egyptian ancestors' sacred society, but what was rejected. But all that's in my book, The Historical Origin of Christianity.
But you're saying that the Europeans came into Egypt without a fight?
They had no fight. Ancient Egyptians didn't have no army. There was no army or jail concept, no place on earth. The only negative disruption of people among each other was in Europe.
They had armies.
No, they didn't have armies. They fought each other. They raped their women. They bludgeoned each other. They stole from each other. You see, that's their history.
Yeah, but they had armies, didn't they?
No, they didn't have to have an army, because see, the rest of the world didn't have an army.
But even against themselves, if they fought each other, they fight each other in terms of tribes in terms of...
Tribes, but not armies,
Okay.
as we know it today.
Yeah.
You see, when the European came into this hemisphere of South and North America, the indigenous South American Indian and the indigenous North American Indian had no armies. They had no concept of fighting because they lived peacefully among each other. Okay, they may have a few little disagreements, but it was not to the point where they want to kill each other. You see? So therefore, there was no armies in South America, North America. Okay? When the Europeans went into Hawaii, there was no army there to keep them out. See, there was no jail concept there. There was no corruption there. Europeans, when they come in, he brings in corruption and brings in the army and fighting, alcohol, drugs, disease, and goes on and on. You see? So when the European came into Africa, the Africans had no concept of fighting with an army. Like I said before, they may have argued among themselves, disagreed on certain things, but they never fought and killed each other and stole from each other where they had to put people in jail. They had no concept of that. You see? That's a European entity. See, like when the Europeans came over in this hemisphere, he was welcome. When he came in Hawaii, he was welcome. In 2 BC, the Chinese built the Great Wall of China to keep the European out. But they had no army or jails over in China. The Indians of India, he went over in India. And you see, even during our time, that was Mahatma Gandhi. You remember Mahatma Gandhi? He went over and took India. India had no army to keep him out. You see that? And you just walk in and take over. See?
Now, you had said earlier that the European civilization,
Non-civilization.
non-civilization, was an illusion. What did you...
It's an illusion because they have built themselves a non-civilization and a pseudo-culture off of mythology. Okay? Now, what they did was this. They came into ancient Egypt and they destroyed the institution of our ancestors, the ancient Egyptians, down to its foundation. As you know, every building that you see erected on earth has a foundation to it.
Correct.
But you can't see that foundation, but you can see the building. So they took our ancestors' institutions and destroyed them down to its foundation. They used that foundation to try to build themselves an institution off. But they built themselves an institution off of lies, deceit, murder, injustice, corruption, slavery, exploitation, religion, mythology, and perverted scholarship. This is what they built themselves an institution off of. So if you take all that together, and you will find that in essence what they created was illusion. Okay? Because when you tell lies about things, then you're setting up and then teach these lies as truths. Then you're setting up an illusion in the mass populace of the world, the people of the world. Like, for instance, the Europeans will teach you that there was a Socrates. There's never been a Socrates. Socrates was supposed to have been the teacher of Plato. There's never been a Plato. Plato was supposed to have been a teacher of Aristotle. There's never been an Aristotle. Aristotle was supposed to have been a teacher of Alexander the Greek. That he wrote so many hundreds of books. And that Alexander built a library called the Great Library for an Aristotle. There's never been an Aristotle. Now, in my book, The Historical Origin of Christianity, I tell you who built what is known as the Great Library of Egypt and why they call it the Great Library of Egypt. Okay, so all in my book, The Historical Origin of Christianity. So then they tell you that that was Herodotus. Never been a Herodotus. They say that the Herodotus is supposed to be the father of history for them, for the Europeans. Never been a Herodotus. Then they tell you that their history, the Europeans' history, started with the Iliad and Odyssey written by Homer, 9th century Homer. Never been a Homer. You see? So the Iliad and the Odyssey and Homer is all based on mythology, something that never existed. They tell you about a Euripides. Never been a Euripides. Never been a Hippocrates or Hippocrates. You see? So these people who are going to medical school and getting their degree, when they graduate, they have to take a Hippocratic oath. There's never been a Hippocrates or Hippocrates, etc. You see? That's all based off of an illusion. See, when you tell lies, it becomes an illusion. As you teach the lie from generation to generation, it becomes an illusion in an individual's mind because they take the untruth that was taught to them to be true.
Let's just deal with a couple of these pseudo fictitious names that you deal with. For an example, you talk about Homer, Plato, Aristotle, and so forth, and you said they never existed.
Correct.
Can you give any proof of that?
Yes. The question that Walter Williams asked, if an individual insisted, well, Walter Williams, you're wrong. There was a Socrates, a Plato, and Aristotle, a Herodotus, and a Homer, etc., and Solon, and so forth and so on. All these Greek names that I just called, supposed to have existed prior to Alexander the Greek coming into Egypt in 332 BCE.
Correct.
My question, Walter Williams' question, has to be asked. What alphabet did these Greek names use? Because the Greeks had no alphabet. They had no alphabet. Prior to Alexander the Greek coming into Egypt in 332 BCE. Alexander forced the Greek language on our ancient Egyptian African ancestors. And our ancient Egyptian African ancestors, being a literate people, the only people on earth that were literate, because they invented the three forms of writing that I have previously mentioned. They applied one of their alphabets to the Greek language, which is the phonetic alphabet, misnomer today and called a Phoenician alphabet. It's never been no Phoenician to have an alphabet. That's all biblical also. Okay? And so the Greeks never had an alphabet, but it was the Greek language that the ancient Egyptians applied an alphabet to. And today, the Europeans are claiming that alphabet that our ancient Egyptian ancestors applied to the Greek language. They're saying that's the Greek alphabet. Greeks never had an alphabet. There's never been an institution that has ever come out of Greece during the time of antiquity. So, name one.
Okay. So you're saying because they had no institutions and no alphabet, they couldn't have wrote anything?
Nothing.
Homer couldn't have wrote?
No, how can he write with what? What he's going to write with? Air?
Maybe he was trained in Egypt.
No. The ancient Egyptians did not take any foreigners in their sacred society. Those were their institution of learning. They didn't take any foreigners in there, nor did they race mix during the time of antiquity. They handpicked their own African kind to study in their sacred institution. And it would never be an uncivilized, savage European Greek who could not read or write. They wouldn't run in no kindergarten over there. They would have to teach this European just basic reading and writing, alphabet. So they didn't accept any foreigners in their sacred society. No. The answer would be no.
Let's go back to the creation of our history through the Bible and try to look at, unravel how that is fictitious. When was the Bible written in terms of its antiquity and its fictitiousness?
Okay.
Can we get into some of that?
Yes, first place, the Bible let's say the Old Testament and the New Testament, or the Holy Bible, which contains the Old and New Testament under one cover. That Bible is strictly for the Christian community of the world.
Before you answer, I just want to ask you one thing about the Greeks before I forget about it. Mm-hmm. Did the Greeks leave? Is there any literature in any form that the Greeks left or that the Romans left that we can read today that is actually an authentic writings by them that talks about what they did and their life and their worldview and etc.?
No. You cannot. These people were illiterate. They had no alphabet to write with to leave a record of that. And then you have to realize, Clemson, that these people are constantly fighting and taking and bludgeoning and murdering and raping and robbing and stealing and lying and cheating. You cannot have no academic community coming out of that type of environment, especially with one not having the alphabet or an institution to sustain their writing. What institution that they created that would, if they wrote anything, that would sustain it? There's none. You got to name the institution that they created and used during their time. Then you can say maybe there was writing left in that institution or created by that institution. They had no institution. You have to have an institution.
But they came into Egypt that was a literate country with plenty of institutions, and they were there long enough for their children to be trained, to be learning.
That's not true. That's not true, because when Ptolemy I Lagi, the successor of Alexander the Greek, Alexander died in 323, Ptolemy took over the rule of Egypt in 323. He tried to get himself admitted in and accepted in the ancient Egyptian sacred society, the same as did Alexander the Greek. Okay? But he was rejected. They didn't take any foreigners in their society. So Ptolemy I Lagi, called Sotar, the word S-O-T-R means savior, came up with a bright idea of saying, if I can find a temple in Egypt that will accept my image and make my image into a god, and after making my image into a god, place that image into the sacred temples throughout Egypt to be worshipped right along with the deity of the ancient Egyptians, Osiris. Okay? Now, he found a temple in Memphis, Egypt to do just that. You see? And they, in Memphis, Egypt, the priests and priestess took two of their deities, Osiris and Apis, and made a composite of the two deities, and they came out with a name of Osirapis or Serapis. And they gave that name to Ptolemy I Lagi, called Sotar. You see? And this is all in my book, The Historical Origin of Christianity. And they, Ptolemy I began to go around to these various sacred temples throughout Egypt, offering his image to be inserted in their sacred society, and he was rejected. So what he did, he closed down all of those institutions. You see? And in the meantime, the Greeks still could not read or write, and the Greeks and the Romans are one and the same race. Okay? So I want to bring that out. And so therefore, there was no institutions. It had been closed down. So whatever the Greeks learned from the ancient Egyptians, the point I'm trying to make, that whatever they learned was not sustained by way of generation to generation, by way of an institution. You have to have an institution to sustain knowledge, because that knowledge that you want to sustain has to be housed in an institution to be taught to the future generations that's coming before you. You see? And those institutions were closed down. So the Greek or the Roman learned from the ancient Egyptian, it died with that individual when he died, until the Hagia Sophia was built by Justinian and his wife Theodora. In 532, Justinian and his wife built the world's first Christian church called the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, Turkey. Okay, that's the world's first Christian church. 5 years later, in 537, they had finished that church, an institution, and university. The teaching staff at the Hagia Sophia were made up of African, Melkite, Coptic Egyptians. They were your faculty. They're the ones that taught the Europeans. That's where the Europeans first began to be taught anything about civilization and what is needed to sustain themselves by way of having and accepting a process of learning. Okay? That's where it began at the Hagia Sophia. So it didn't begin during the time of antiquity. Like George M. James in his Stolen Legacy said that the Greeks studied with the ancient Egyptians. No, they didn't. Okay? They studied, the Greeks and the Romans and the Europeans began to study at the Hagia Sophia. And you have to have an institution to disseminate knowledge from that can be disseminated and sustained from generation to generation. Prior to the Hagia Sophia, the world's first Christian church, built by Justinian and his wife in 532, finished in 537, the Europeans had no institution.
I want to come back to 532 and the first Christian church, but during the time of the Roman occupation of Egypt, wasn't there intermarriage? I mean, the Romans brought great armies, brought a large number of people into North Africa. Did they make North Africa their seat of power? Did they remain there? Were the majority of the people that remained in North Africa, were they the Melkite Coptic Egyptians? Did a lot of Romans come in? Did they mix and marry? And what impact did the Egyptians that were in North Africa have on the Roman Empire? Weren't they black popes and black emperors of Rome?
No. Rome did not have a church. You got to remember now.
I'm not talking about the church.
Well, that's
talking about the political.
But you mentioned pope.
Yes.
Okay, so you had to have a church to have a pope.
Yes, that's true.
Okay, so there was no pope in Europe. Now, let's get back to your first question. When Alexander came into Egypt with his entourage, thereafter, we're talking about 332 BCE, after that, then other Europeans coming out of southern Europe and southern Russia began to come in there in droves. They came and settled all along North Africa, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Mauritania, etc., etc. Okay? They began to settle in Turkey, which is northeast Africa. They call it, and renamed it today, the Middle East. They began to come out of southern Russia and settle in what is known as Iran, what is known as Iraq, what is known as Saudi Arabia, etc., etc. All those land areas that I mentioned were occupied by indigenous Africans. They began to come in and push those Africans out. Okay? So there was a large influx of Europeans coming in to the continent of Africa after Alexander came into Egypt. Okay? And they began to, of course, they began to force themselves on African women. Okay? And yes, they did intermix with each other at that point only. See, by way of force. This is what you have to understand. So now, what was your other question?
No, I was asking because there were contingents of Africans who made up the Roman army. There were some battalions for all Africans. They talk about the one that went into Britain. They talk about the African battalion that went into Germany.
What year?
Patron Saint. I'm not sure the year, but in around AD 200, I think they had a contingent of Africans that went into Britain. And there were African people in Britain.
Well, that's debatable. That's an area that you really have to investigate, and you have to really know what you're talking about, and you really got to study by way of focusing in on that time period and study that time period. You said 200 ABCE. You know, I don't use AD because that's never been a Jesus Christ to use AD after the death of our Lord or Anno Dominus. You know, I don't use that. I use ABCE. That's in my book. Also, the historical origin of Christianity. But you have to study that area and that time which you're talking about to really get an understanding before anything can be said about that area. But like I mentioned to you before, there was no popes. You got to see, there was no popes, no African popes in Europe or in Rome, because Rome did not have the seat of Christianity. The seat of Christianity was in Africa, in the Hagia Sophia. See, you don't get the seat of Christianity was transferred out of Africa in the 15th century.
In the 15th century?
Yes, sir, into Europe. And like I mentioned to you before, they began to first build St. Peter's Church, known today as St. Peter's Basilica, in 1445. That's the 15th century. And it took them 181 years, in 1626, to build what is known as Vatican City. Okay? And they built St. Peter's Church, called Basilica today, over the catacombs. All the Vatican is built over the catacombs anyway. But they wanted to build over the catacombs for a reason. Because by them building St. Peter's Church over the catacombs, they are saying that we are building this church over the tomb of Peter. See, because the Pope today gets his authority as the vicar of Christ from supposed Peter. See, Peter supposed to have told, Christ was supposed to have told Peter to build my church on this rock, etc., etc. You know, that's all tradition. So that's the reason why they created St. Peter's Church and built St. Peter's Church over the catacombs, supposedly over the tomb of Peter. And then you got to go back to find out about Peter. You go back to the time when they said that Rome was burning, or Rome burned in 67, and they used the term AD. When Nero played his violin while Rome burned. You heard that story.
Yes, right.
And one of his aides came to Nero and said, the reason why Rome is burning is because the Christians set it on fire. And he ordered his army general to go and get Peter and Paul. This is all traditional religious Christian stories. To get Peter and Paul, and they took Peter and Paul into the circus area, or the arena, where they held different, supposedly, different events. And they took Peter and Paul, and they tied them up by their feet and let them hang upside down until the blood rushed to their head and eventually killed them. And then the Christians supposed to have come into the arena and cut Peter and Paul down and took them down in the catacombs and buried them. See? So now the Roman Catholic Church building St. Peter's Basilica over the catacombs, over the supposed tomb of Peter. There's never been a Peter. There was never been a Christ. And we're talking about first century. 67 is first century. There was never a Christ, Christianity, or a Christian church in the first century. You don't get a Christ until the 5th century at the Council of Ephesus. Read my book, The Historical Origin of Christianity, will tell you that. You don't get Christianity coming about for the very first time in history until the close of the Council of Chalcedon, 451. You don't get a Christian church until Justinian and his wife Theodora builds a Christian church in 532, finish it in 537. You see? So therefore, in the first century, there was no Christ, no Christianity, and no Christian church, and no religion called Christianity. See? So that's all false and fictitious stories that's put into traditional Christian teaching.
Now this gives you a whole new perspective on that whole time period and how the Romans would have been acting in North Africa. If you're saying that there was no Christianity, etc., then basically their morals, their values, and their worldview would have been the same as the barbarians they were when they came in. So you would have had the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, still trying to maintain a spiritual system of life. But what I'd like to ask you is the majority of the ancient Egyptians, did they remain in North Africa? What was, as far as your studies show, the interrelationship between those Romans and those ancient Egyptians? Did they move south? What happened to them?
They were pushed south.
They were pushed south.
Yeah, the ones that didn't that was unable to stay, they went south into Africa, going south into Africa. Okay, and then the influx of Europeans kept coming in. You see, so today you look over there, you see nothing but European faces under the name of Arab. You see, and you see very few indigenous Africans over there. You see.
So there had to be a lot of killing of indigenous people, just like here where the native Americans, native people here were slaughtered and pushed further.
Right. See, anywhere Europeans go, they bring death and destruction and disease and ignorance with them. Okay, everywhere they go. See, our ancient Egyptian ancestors civilized this whole entire world. The Europeans terrorized this whole entire world, including themselves in Europe. They're, at this very moment, terrorizing themselves right now in Europe, Kosovo, and other parts of Europe. At this very moment.
Okay, I want to move out of North Africa, but I just want to ask you one other question. When I say move out, I want to progress. But in terms of the spiritual system that the Egyptians, that the ancient Egyptians had, they were able to maintain that to a certain degree. You say Lagi Sola wanted to be made into an ancient Egyptian god and be worshipped along with the other Egyptian deities. And you got a Melchite Coptic church to...
Not a church, but a sacred society.
Sacred society to accept it. Now, how was this then accepted by the Romans themselves as they began to follow or worship? How did that work itself through?
Well, you see, every Greek, starting with every Greek author, Ptolemy I Lagi, whose image was used and given the name Serapis, whose image is still used today and given the name Christ. Every Ptolemy or every Ptolemaic ruler and Roman ruler after Ptolemy I Lagi called Sotar, they sat on the throne and ruled Egypt as the vicar of Serapis. So they, the Greeks and the Romans, began to worship Serapis and Isis, one of the ancient Egyptian female deities in the ancient Egyptian divine triad of Osiris the father, Isis the holy Hathor cow mother, and Horus Jr., the S-U-N of that triad. You see? So this Serapis, which is a European white man that is known back then during the time as Serapis, known today as Jesus Christ, was always matched with Isis. So
the black female,
the African female,
yeah.
Isis. Okay, and that's what the Greeks and the Romans began to worship. Okay, now another thing is said about suppose black popes of Rome. That's not true. Let me go back to that. You see, Constantine gave Sylvester I, this is in my book, I advise an individual to buy my book, The Historical Origin of Christianity, to really understand what I'm talking about, because I lay it out in a progressive progression.
Right.
Okay? And after the donation of Constantine was given to Sylvester I by one Constantine and accepted by Sylvester I, the donation of Constantine goes like this. If Sylvester accepted the donation of Constantine, he was given Constantine's imperial power and authority over the Coptic Egyptian community.
Now that community was separate from the Roman community.
Oh yes, and the Greeks too. Okay? And what he wanted after Sylvester accepted the donation of Constantine was to be baptized in that community and made part of it. But he had no authority over that community. So in essence, he was given, making Sylvester the H-N-I-C.
Head Negro in charge
Correct.
of the Coptic Egyptians.
Coptic Egyptians, in charge of the Coptic Egyptians only, on a temporal basis, provided that Sylvester could get the rest of the Coptic Egyptians to worship this European image, then known as Serapis, now known today as Jesus the Christ. It's all in my book.
Now, this is what I want to ask you. The Coptic Egyptian system, spiritual system, was different from what the Romans were worshiping through worshiping Serapis and Isis, but they were not mixing in terms of the Coptic Egyptian spiritual system and the European system that they were worshiping.
Correct.
What was the difference? Was there any difference?
Yeah, the Coptic Egyptians, they continued to pay homage to their ancestors in that ancient Egyptian divine triad of Osiris the father, Isis the holy Hathor cow mother, and Horus Jr., the S-U-N. That's what they paid homage to. Whereby the Greeks worshiped this Serapis that we know today as Jesus Christ, along with Isis. Okay?
What would their worship have kind of been like? It was different. What was the difference?
I just got to explain it to you the difference.
Yeah, but I mean, in values and in morals and worldview, there had to be a difference. I mean, the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, worshipped the order and principles of the universe.
You've answered you just said.
Then what did the Romans and Greeks? What was their worldview and their values and culture?
Physical form, not spiritual form. See, the ancient Egyptians had a spiritual connection to their ancestors that made up the ancient Egyptian divine triad. That was a spiritual connection there, because that's their ancestors. That's something in reality to them. the Greeks and the Romans worshiped Serapis, which is man-made, a created creature, and Isis, the only deity of the two that were real, but not real to the Greeks and the Romans because they had no spiritual connection to Isis. See, they had no spiritual connection to Serapis, just a physical connection only. See, there's a difference between a physical being and a spiritual being. And the ancient Egyptians were a spiritual body, whereby the Greeks was a physical body. That's your difference. And see, getting back to, like J. Rogers put in our community, 100 known facts about the Negro, about these so-called black popes. That's misinformation. Okay? Getting back to the donation of Constantine, the ecclesiastical authority, by way of the donation of Constantine, was now in the hands of the Melkite Coptic African Egyptian. Okay? That was given to Sylvester I in 313 and 314 during that time period. Okay? Let's skip in time and go up to 553 at the Council of Constantinople II, which was called by Justinian. That prior to that calling of the Council of Constantinople II, 553, he and his wife had built the Hagia Sophia, like I mentioned, in 532, finished in 537. Now he wanted to be the head of that church. He couldn't be the head of that church because of the donation of Constantine. See? Because ecclesiastical authority was in the hands of the Melkite African Egyptian. You see? So, an African advisor by the name of Theodore Ausitus told him how to take back the donation of Constantine.
Right.
It's all in my book. And so his advice to Justinian was to try to get Vigilius to take up a communion with the Monophysites. See, the Monophysites, you have to understand about the Monophysites, that's all in my book too,
Correct.
in order for you to understand the historical origin of Christianity. Now, when the Hagia Sophia was built and finished in 537, a man by the name of Agapetus I, a Coptic Egyptian, had the donation of Constantine, or ecclesiastical authority. And what happened to Agapetus I, who was an African? He died a mysterious death. That means that Justinian had him killed. Then his successor was Silvius I. And Theodora had her army general and his wife to serve treason papers on Silvius. And they got rid of him, disposed of him. Then the next Coptic Egyptian, Melkite Coptic Egyptian, to hold the ecclesiastical authority by way of the donation of Constantine was one Vigilius. And this is where Theodore Ausitus advised Justinian how to get and take away the donation of Constantine. You see? Now, this is what he told him to do. He told him to get him to denounce the 3 chapters. See, what I'm saying is technical, but it's in my book. And it's also into encyclopedias and other books of that nature. You see, but the 3 chapters was used in the Council of Chalcedon of 451 against Nestorius. That's in my book too. But that's technical. But you have to read the book in order for you to really understand what I'm talking about. Now, at this moment, like I said before, the donation of Constantine, or the authority of ecclesiastical power and authority was now in the hands of one African, Vigilius, and Justinian wanted that authority. So Theodore Osidus, his African lawyer and advisor, told him two things to do. So you get Vigilius to denounce the three chapters. The three chapters, like I said before, was used at the Council of Chalcedon against Nestorius, who said that the created creature, the Virgin Mary, with the created title of Theotokos. The Theotokos means the Mother of God, and God meaning Serapis at the time, who was going to become Christ. Nestorius would not accept that title, but that you have to read that in my book, which explains that. Now, he wanted Vigilius to denounce the three chapters. The three chapters written by three African bishops, Theodoret, and Ibis of Odessa. Okay? And the second thing he advised Justinian to get Vigilius to do was to take up communion with the Monophysites. You see? And that really went against the grain of Vigilius, because Vigilius was a diaphysitic Christian. A diaphysitic Christian is an individual who believes in the two natures of Christ, one spiritual and one human, whereby a monophysite only believes in the one nature of Christ, spiritual but no human nature. That's monophysitic teachings and doctrine. Okay, so Vigilius refused to do either of the two, and he was hound and chased until they killed him. And at the Council of Constantinople II, Justinian took back the donation of Constantine, and now he had ecclesiastical authority in his power over the Church of the Hagia Sophia, or the Church of the Holy Wisdom, which is another name for Jesus the Christ. He also had political authority as being the Byzantine emperor. Now, as ecclesiastical, or with his ecclesiastical authority, he was able to appoint bishops of the Hagia Sophia by way of appointing patriarchs. And a patriarch is nothing but a bishop. Okay? Now, the Hagia Sophia represented the churches, other churches that was being built in Europe, in Rome, in France, in Germany, etc., etc. You see, but the first church outside of Africa was built in Rome, Italy. See, so but the patriarch of the Hagia Sophia was the patriarch of the Western churches. You see, and all those patriarchs of the Hagia Sophia were African men. See, so a patriarch is nothing but a bishop. See, so the patriarch of the Hagia Sophia, being an African bishop, was also the Bishop of Rome. See, that's where a lot of you historians get mixed up. Now, also, the Byzantine rulers also picked the Patriarch of Constantinople. Now, what is the Patriarch of Constantinople? The Patriarch of Constantinople is the bishop also, but he is the Patriarch and Bishop of the Monophysites, because you still had those two factions arguing with each other. The diaphysitic Christians, like I explained to you, believing that Christ, no, two natures, spiritual and human. The Monophysites said only one nature, spiritual, Osiris-like spirit, but no human nature. See, so they had a polemic going there. You see? So all of your Byzantine rulers picked the patriarch of the Hagia Sophia, which represented the European churches. You see? And they became the Bishop of Rome. Then the Byzantine rulers picked the Patriarch of Constantinople. that represented the Monophysite community. But both bishops, both patriarchs, had offices in the same building, the Hagia Sophia. Just like you have in Washington, D.C., in the Capitol, you have both political parties having offices in the White House.
Right.
The Democrats and the Republicans. You see, same thing.
Byzantine.
Byzantine.
Byzantine. Can you talk about the Byzantine word when that power came about? What is Byzantine?
The Byzantine rule, or Roman rule, is designated for Africa, or they call it the East, okay, as opposed to the West, which is Europe, okay. Now, Constantine went into Turkey in an area called Byzantium in 324. And he changed that name Byzantium, the little city in Turkey. He changed that to be called Constantinople. Today it's called Istanbul, Turkey. Okay, but then it was Byzantium. He changed it and named it after himself and called it Constantinople. Okay? And they built a double wall city, or a double wall around the city. Okay? And that was the seat, or the capital, of the Byzantine Empire in the East, or in Africa. You see? So, this is in 324. But the Byzantine Empire did not start until 395. That was the beginning of the Byzantine Empire, 395. And it lasted all the way up until 1453, when Muhammad II penetrated the double-walled city of Constantinople and seized the Hagia Sophia. By that time, they had transferred the seat of Christianity out of Africa, out of the Hagia Sophia, out of Constantinople, into Europe, like I mentioned to you before, into Rome, on the outskirts of Rome, over the catacombs. They began to build St. Peter's Church. So the Byzantine Empire officially began in 395, and it ended in 1453.
But it was territory that was conquered, and it had the culture.
Yeah, well, see, the territory was parts of Africa, especially the northeast Africa and North Africa along the Mediterranean, and parts of Europe, parts of southern Europe, and parts of Russia. You see, that all encompassed the Byzantine Empire.
And the armies were who led those armies?
Different men from time to time, but you had so many Byzantine emperors, you see, through history. And in my book, I'm writing my second book called The Historical Origin of Islam. I'm saying there's no Prophet Muhammad, and what I did, like in my first book, to write the historical origin of Christianity, I had to follow Serapis all through history to get to the time when this Serapis image that we know today as Jesus Christ was transformed into the Christ. I had to follow Byzantine history from 319 all the way up to 1453 to get the understanding about no Prophet Muhammad and how that all came about.
Is the Byzantine Empire an extension of Roman Empire?
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So Rome really did not fall. And when did Rome fall?
Rome actually never fell. Okay? Didn't fall per se, and someone else took over. They were always being invaded and penetrated, etc., etc. You know, even in 800, ACE, Empress Irene had appointed Charlemagne to take over the rule of Rome, because Rome was under the Byzantine Empire, and she was, as empress, she was a Byzantine empress, you see. So Rome was always being invaded by people coming out of southern Europe, etc., etc. And Italy, which is in where Rome is at, in Italy. So there was always a constant invasion, but Rome itself never fell. Okay, maybe the Roman power was weakened, but then you had the Byzantine power, which is connected to what we call Roman power. The Byzantine Empire and Constantinople were called the New Rome. That's known as New Rome in history.
Now, when did that, when the Arabs penetrate North Africa out of Morocco? We're talking about 700.
You're speaking. Are you speaking of Moors? Are you speaking of Moors? Okay.
Because you have the church, which becomes the Sophia Hagia, which becomes the first institution that really began to teach and
the Europeans.
Yeah, the Europeans, and bring civilization to Europeans. Now, they spread how far over Europe?
Well, see, you have two factions of Moors. First, you got to know the meaning of the name Moor. The word Moor is only a name given to two groups. One, the Saracen Moors, which are Arabs. What makes a Moor is an individual who comes from Morocco in North Africa, and Mauritania in North Africa, crossing the Mediterranean, going into Spain. Okay, and it said that these Arab Saracen Moors in 711 crossed out of Morocco and Mauritania, crossed the Mediterranean, going into Spain to invade the Spaniards there. Okay, who were Christians. Now, they're calling these Arab Moors, they're calling them Muslims. There was no Islam in the 8th century. There was no Islam or no Mohammedism. My book will bring that out, The Historical Origin of Islam. But there was monophysites. They were monophysites. They're people who believed in the one nature of Christ, okay, as being a spiritual nature but no human nature. So they was penetrating over there. They came over there with destruction. Everywhere Europeans go, they don't bring harmony, they bring death, destruction, and disease. So this is what they bought over there. See, that's in 711. Then you have the real Moors, or the Africans. See, they came into Spain in 1051. See, but they were the Coptic Egyptian Africans with a high civilization. They got this high civilization as a continuance coming from their ancient Egyptian ancestors, the ancient Egyptians. They were your mathematicians. They were your scientists. They were your builders. They were everything that we know today as being a civilized person. They had it.
Now, they were coming out of Morocco also?
They crossed over from Morocco and other parts of Africa into Spain. But they came over into Spain and they built up those great cities that we know today as Seville, Cordova, and Granada, and etc. They brought all that in, but they brought a high civilization into Spain. Everywhere African people go, we're talking about the ancient Egyptians, everywhere they went, they brought a high civilization to whomever they came in contact with. And Spain was no exception.
I want to go back to Christian diversification of history through writing it as.
Unless you want to just change the.
I want to change the subject a little bit now. Come back to the creation of history around the Bible, but I want to ask you about the monetary system that we have today. How was it created? Let's start at the origins of the monetary system.
Well, when you said monetary system that we have today, you have to go back to the time when the Europeans was using precious metal and jewelry as something of value. Okay. Precious metal means gold and silver, and jewelry means gems, diamonds and rubies, and you name it, you know. That was your monetary system at that time, okay, until the Lombards came into being. The Lombards came out of Germany into the north of France. Into the north of Italy. They came out of Germany into the north of Italy. And they began to overrun and take over Italy, etc., and to the point where they control all the natural resources in Italy, they control the commerce of Italy, and they control the land of Italy. They became land barons, and etc., etc. They created what is known as the feudal system, so forth and so on. I was taking you through a fast-paced, supposed history of how money that we know it today, which is paper money, first came into existence. But the monetary system was under the control of whoever owned precious metal and jewelry and jewels, etc. So you have the Lombards coming in, 543, out of Germany into the north of Italy.
Now, they were not a family, they were a tribe.
The group. And they created what is known as dukes. Okay? And those dukes constituted families, their own personal families. They were thugs and vandals. They would do anything to gain something of value, physical value, material value, etc., etc. And in the beginning of the 13th century, 1202-03, long story short, they created what is known as paper money, and by creating paper money with a usury tax, which is an interest tax, they changed the monetary system for the whole entire world. See, because those kings and things were really treating them unfair. You see, they were confiscating their land. They were putting heavy taxes on them, and so forth and so on. So what they did to the king was that they changed the monetary system by creating paper money. See, now the king is sitting up there with precious metal, gold and silver, and jewelry, etc., etc. So they created a system using paper money in the beginning of 13th century. And they began to open and create banks using this paper money, issuing this paper money with an interest fee.
Well, how did they have the power to do that?
They were already rich people anyway. They created a system. See, if you can create a system and have people to initiate that system and sustain that system, then you can initiate a change. You see? In other words, just like the typewriter is obsolete today. You got the computer. So whoever created the computer made the typewriter obsolete. You see? So they just came up with this idea of having paper money instead of coin money, gold and silver. See? Came up with this idea of I'll loan you this paper money at a interest. But you put up a collateral. Your collateral will be your jewelry. You see that? And or either certain gold coins, because now the gold coins that you have really has no value as this paper money, because they have put a high value on this paper money. So you put up your jewelry to get a loan of this paper money. And they began to open up their first bank in the north of Italy. The second bank, they went into the south of France. And that's how the banking system using paper money began. You see? And from that point, they began to expand that monetary system, because now they control the printing press that prints the legal money. You see? And that's how it began. So far as money is concerned, paper money is concerned.
Oh, so they control the printing press from the very beginning.
Correct.
Now, are they Jews?
Well, see, that's a tricky question. You say a Jew, it means, did they practice the religion of Judaism? You know, that's the question. That constitutes a person being a Jew. If you practice a religion called Judaism, okay, then you're a Jew. If you practice a religion called Christianity, then you're a Christian. If you practice a religion called Islam, then you're a Muslim. So forth and so on. So that's a tricky question. The Rockefeller family married into the Rothschild family. But the Rockefeller family are not Jews. They're Baptist Christians by way of religion. In order to be a Jew, you have to embrace a religion called Judaism. All capitalists who are capitalists today does not practice Judaism. Some of them are atheists. So some of them practice other religions, but not Judaism. See, so I don't get the impression that since this person is strictly dealing in a capital community, that he has to be a Jew. So I want to clear that up. Okay?
Now, what was the impact of the monetary system ultimately around the world? What did it develop into, and some of its offsprings today?
Well, the impact is very strong. I mentioned paper money with a usury tax started with the Lombards, right? They are still operating today in London, England, on a street called Lombard Street. That's where all your banking houses are. You see? Rothschilds, the House of Rothschild, Solomon Brothers, Brown Brothers. And they have an insignia of the three balls. If you go to a pawn shop today, you see three balls hanging out there. Those three balls represent buy, sell, and lend. See? Now, that banking institution on Lombard Street in 1913 set up the Federal Reserve in this country. By sending the War brothers over here to set up the Federal Reserve in 1913. Today, you have the Federal Reserve. They also set up the IMF and the World Bank, International Monetary Fund. See, they control that. They own the World Bank. They own IMF. They own the Federal Reserve of the United States of America.
You mean the American government?
It's owned by the Federal Reserve. All your congressmen, senators, the president, everybody. This whole country is owned by the Federal Reserve.
What do you mean, owned by the Federal Reserve?
The United States government borrows money from the Federal Reserve.
All right.
And if they're broke, or if an individual is broke, where do they go to get their money from? The Federal Reserve. Okay? Who owns the printing press to print the money that loans the United States government money coming from the Federal Reserve? The Federal Reserve. They own the printing press that prints the money. So whoever owns the printing press got the power.
And the Lombards own the printing press?
Yes, sir. Definitely. The Lombards own they own the Federal Reserve and the printing press. They own IMF. They own the World Bank. And that's how they control the whole entire world today under one world order. That's called one world order. Whoever owns the printing press owns the whole entire world.
Okay. Now, what impact does this have on places throughout Africa in terms of their money and the devaluing of their money on a daily basis? I'll just give you an example. A friend of mine from Ghana said he was going to put $1 million in the bank of Ghanaian money last year. He said he's glad he did, because had he put $1 million in the bank last year, this year the money had devaluated, Ghanaian money had devaluated over 50%, and he would have lost, instead of the money gaining interest, he would have actually lost 50% of the money that he put in the bank, because when he was going to put it in the bank, one Ghanaian dollar was worth 2,500 American. One American dollar was worth 2,500 Canadian dollars. A year later, one American dollar is worth over 5,000 Canadian dollars. So had he put the money in there, he would have lost 50% of his money. What impact does the IMF, does the World Bank have on the countries around the world, particularly those of Africa, where they set the value of these currencies?
Well, the IMF and the monetary controllers and rulers of the monetary system for the world, like I told you, it comes out of Lombard Street in England. They go around the country, go around the world, and they create countries and develop countries to be poor. They set up a country and make sure that country is poor, like Mexico, poor. That was done on purpose. On purpose. Just shut them out. Devalue their money. The money on the world monetary market is very low. See? Cut out certain industry over there. See? This is part of how they exploit people. They create poverty for you in order for you to ask them for money. You see? And when you go and ask them for money, the IMF, the first thing they tell you that you have to devalue your money. In other words, your money is no more good anymore. It's worthless. You have to declare that your money is worthless. Once you do that, then we, the IMF, will loan you money. Okay? Now, along with the IMF loaning you money, there are certain stipulations, meaning that an individual country who borrows money from the IMF has to agree to allow private investors to come into their country and invest in their country by any means necessary as the investors see fit to do, and that the officials of that country or the citizens of that country cannot complain or object to what these private investors are doing in their country. And if they do, then they will have to suffer the consequence. That's the stipulation. And once you get hooked into that loan, you will forever, that country will be forever in debt or indebted to the IMF. Okay? So it's an endless process that they created. They create the money system. They create whose currency is devalued, whose currency is worth this, and they keep bringing it up and down, up and down. See? They control that. Why? Because they control the printing press that prints the money. Whoever controls the printing press that prints the money has got the power. Because if you and I had a printing press in our basement to print money, we would never be broke.
Then they do have the power to bring about a one-world government.
Correct.
And in fact, they've already brought about.
Correct. Absolutely. That's what these demonstrations are being done today. You know, they was in Washington demonstrating against the IMF. You know, they were in, I believe, in California demonstrating against the IMF. You know, so forth and so on. See, so there are demonstrations against the IMF being broken out all over the world now, in different places. They're protesting against the one world order.
And this came about
Starting with the Lombards
in what year?
in the 13th, beginning of the 13th century, when they created paper money and the banking system with interest, a usury fee.
Okay. Now I want to go back to that Bible and looking at not the Bible itself, but looking at the printing press and when they used the Bible to create history. Now we had said that places like Solomon's Temple, all of these places in the Bible, Babylon, these places had to be created to substantiate or validate the Bible or the biblical stories.
Correct.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Explain some of that.
Those places are only mentioned or told about in the Bible. Those are biblical stories based off of mythology. Those stories are coming out of the Old Testament. The Old Testament comes from the religion called Judaism. See? So you're going to get all of these pseudo-pigrapha stories, false and fictitious stories, coming out of the religion called Judaism. That's where it's coming from. The Persian, Mesopotamia, the Sumerian, the Hyksos. It goes on and on. All Noah and his ark, the flood story, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. All that comes from the religion called Judaism via the Bible. Stories told in the Bible. See? That's all pseudo-pigrapha literature. Now, they teach you and teach the world masses that of the three major Western religions, Judaism is first. And then they teach you from Judaism came Christianity because they tell you that Jesus Christ was a Jew. And from Judaism and Christianity came Islam, historically incorrect. The world's first man-made religion was Christianity. The second one was Monophysitism that became Mohammedanism. Mohammedanism became Islam in 1919 when they created the Quran for the very first time in history. The Quran was formulated in 1870 in Syria and finished 49 years later and accepted by the Mohammedan world in 1919 in Cairo, Egypt. That's history. Okay. Now, getting back to Judaism. Judaism was created by one Solomon Bar Isaac called Rashid between 1180 and 1200. Okay, so between late 11th and early 12th century. That's when Judaism came about. Judaism cannot predate one Rashi. Judaism as a religion cannot predate the first crusade of 1096. Can't do it. There's no Judaism prior to the late 11th and early 12th century. There was no Judaism prior to the first crusade of 1096.
What does the crusade have to do with Judaism?
That's a measurement of how that one can use to deny the existence of a Judaism, because there was no Judaism before the first crusade. You see, the first crusade has a lot to do with Judaism. You had the Barron army going into Northeast Africa. That's where your crusades took place. The Europeans coming out of Europe, going into Africa, creating what we know today as the Crusades. Okay? Now, the first Barron army that was sent over there was under the leadership of Godfrey and his brother Baldwin. Godfrey and his brother Baldwin, or Godfrey was a student of Rashi. Let me tell you about Rashi. See, Rashi, Solomon Bar, as they call Rashi, was the first one to create the formula for Judaism. He created what is known as Sefer HaYasa literature. Sefer means books, Ha means of, Yasa means books of the upright one, talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those are the upright ones.
So he wrote these stories.
He wrote and created these stories. He was the world's first rabbi.